Way back when I was a 20s-something, coming out of seminary, there was a Presbyterian minister who I knew who was a wise old soul. Now, I say wise old soul, and then I realized this morning as I was preparing that wise old soul is about the age I am now. But when you're in your 20-somethings, that's a wise old soul. And he gave me some advice that was very helpful for me as I began the process of becoming a Presbyterian minister and interviewing for positions. And if you know anything about the process, if you're a candidate for a church, you're usually interviewing with any number of churches at the same time, and you're going to visit them, and they interview you, and you got to learn the skills of interviewing with an entire committee. And when you're first starting out, it's a little intimidating. But this wise old soul told me that at some point or another, the search committee is going to take you to a restaurant. And you're going to eat together, and you're going to have fellowship, but they're also going to be interviewing you at the restaurant, asking you questions to which you have to respond. And he said, there's one important thing for you to remember. While that evening is going on, be polite to the wait staff. Be nice to them. Thank them every time they come and do something for you, because inevitably when you're sitting there with a committee, someone's going to be paying attention to that. Well, I took his words to heart, and when I went on interviews and we went out to a restaurant, I was very, very appreciative to the wait staff every time. And it was kind of good because, when you're a 20-something and you're looking for a job and it's the excitement of it and you're all about knowing all the answers to theology and ministry questions, the last thing you're thinking about in a restaurant is the wait staff. You're thinking about making a good impression and so on and so forth. So I really did take that advice to heart, and I was very polite and nice and said thank you every time. And what I noticed was doing that really was more than me just trying to get a job. I began to learn that that's something I ought to be doing anyway. I ought to be getting outside of myself. When any of us go to a restaurant, we go to eat, but we go with personal agenda. We got maybe friends. We're going to visit. We're going to joke. We're going to have fun. And maybe we're not paying attention to the wait staff as much as we should. And this reminds us that even when we're in the middle of our stuff, we ought to be getting out of ourselves and really saying a word of thank you to the wait staff. And so I noticed that was changing me, but what I also noticed was most of the people I was with, the majority, don't do that. You don't see it happen that often, and it was true with all the committees that I interview, and I'd be doing it. And when you do it, you begin to notice who doesn't. And the vast majority of the committees that interviewed me didn't do it. So some did, but the vast majority didn't. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm pure as the driven snow. Because if you ask my family, and my wife is here and she remembers this well, this is the story that's going to be told at my funeral. The kids were teenagers. It was after church. We went to Steak and Shake as a family, and we're sitting around the table, and Dad's not having a good day at Steak and Shake. And I made the waitress cry. And Ruth said, after the waitress left, and I didn't see her cry, she went away and Ruth could see her in the distance crying, and Ruth said, "You made her cry." And I said, No, I didn't. No, I didn't really, did I? And my daughter says, "Dad, this is so embarrassing. I got to see that girl in school." And then my son, who doesn't usually say much, says, "Not cool, Dad, not cool." So, I know what it is to not be nice to the wait staff, but ever since that old soul gave me that good advice, I have, for the most part, worked really hard to make sure that they come and fill my water. I say thank you, acknowledge their presence, acknowledge that they're doing something for me, more than just the tip, but just a word to say thank you. Because you know what? Thank you Just to say it, not just say thanks in a passing way, but to say thank you, to connect, to look in the eye, to say thank you to the person, really is that one act, that one human act that takes us out of ourselves and connects us to the other in a way that most things don't. I read an article this week, and I want to share it with you because I think it's really, really a good article. It was written by a practicing psychologist. The title of the article was 7 Qualities of Chronically Unhappy People. Let me show you them. Your default belief is that life is hard. Now, we know life can be challenging and hard at times. Yes, we all admit that. We know those times. But we're talking about the people whose default belief is that life is hard. That's the way they see life on a regular daily basis. It will guarantee unhappiness. You believe that most people can't be trusted. You've met people like that. Maybe you felt that yourselves at times. You feel that most people can't be trusted, and it's the biggest lie we tell ourselves. Because we can trust. Most people are good, and we can trust people. You always got to beware. You always got to be prepared. You always got to be careful. But to have a default belief that you believe that most people can't be trusted is really internally, psychologically, and emotionally destructive to us. You concentrate on what's wrong with the world rather than what's right. We all know that. We've done it. We know people who do it on a regular basis, and the newspapers don't help us with that much. I mean, we read a lot of terrible things in the news, and that makes us think that everything's bad, and we know better. It's not. And we're challenged by that to remember that the world is good. God made the world good. And if we look outside of ourselves, we can see that. You compare yourself to others and harbor jealousy. And we know what that feels like. You know, I wish I was, you know, and at low self-esteem, a struggle with who you are, and then you project that upon another and you have jealous feelings, that makes you unhappy as well. You strive to control every minor detail of your life, and that will drive you crazy because you can't control every detail of life. You just can't do it. We're not supermen and superwomen in this world, and if we think we can control every minor detail, we are going to make ourselves terribly, terribly unhappy throughout the journey of our lives. You think about your future with worry and fear. And that's just not who we are. That's not who God has made us to be. God has made us to be hopeful people. That's the whole gospel. That's what Christ brought, hope. And we're not meant. Jesus even said in his Beatitudes, do not worry, but trust in God. Because worry and fear will destroy us, will destroy our spirits. And finally, you fill yourself with your conversations with gossip and complaint. Paul called gossip one of the 7 deadlies. He lists it up there with some of the worst things we can imagine as sins. Gossip is in that list, folks. And let me tell you, I've been in the church long enough. I don't have to go any further. When we look back, when we look at what was, we look at what they did to us or to somebody else, and we keep it alive by moving it forward instead of talking about the possibility that lays ahead. We have set ourselves in stone forever, and we'll never get out of that unless we are able to shake ourselves out and look forward to possibilities and not those things we can gossip and complain about that have occurred in the past. All these things, if we dwell upon them, will make us chronically unhappy. And all of these qualities have one thing in common. It's all about being inside ourselves. It's not about looking out, and if we do look out, it's about looking out in a negative fashion. But But what we are being taught by the gospel of Jesus Christ is that we're all called upon, we're all motivated. The Spirit moves us all to be able to look outside ourselves with positive eyes, with the understanding behind them that all that God has made for us is good. You know, we think about the 9 who didn't come back. Jesus healed them all of leprosy. And then we think about the 9 who didn't come back. And even Jesus asked a brief question about where the other 9 were when the one showed up. And that's an innocent question that's obvious and anybody would ask. But it's important in this story to recognize that after asking the question, Jesus moved on. Had nothing more to say about the 9, but just moved on. But we wonder, how come those other 9 didn't come back? And there's a lot of different reasons why they might not have. But I want to show you something because I want to set some context to an understanding which Jesus would have had about why the 9 would have struggled to even come back and say thanks. Let's take a look at this. In Leviticus 13, it says this: "The leprous person is unclean. The priest must pronounce him unclean, and his disease is on his head. The leper who has the disease shall wear torn clothes and let the hair of his head hang loose, and he shall cover his upper lip and cry, 'Unclean, unclean.' He shall remain unclean as long as he has the disease. He is unclean. He shall dwell in a habitation outside the camp." This is Jewish law about what was supposed to be done with the leper. When the priest said you had leprosy, this was the law to be followed. Now, yes, we've got to be careful about contagion. They didn't know about contagion in those days. They thought leprosy was a curse of God. But anyway, you had to be careful and separate those so you don't catch it from someone. Yes, they didn't have that kind of science, but the teaching was these people had to be separate in a way. But just think for a minute about the violence of that law upon that person who was afflicted. How painfully troubling this was to the very being, the very soul of the afflicted person, to be ostracized in that way, to be set apart, to have to behave in that manner. That's violence on the human soul. You know, and it looks a lot like this. These are quotations that came weeks ago at the height of that whole Ebola hysteria. 2 different quotations from very well-known people whom I will not mention. The first statement: "The U.S. must immediately stop all flights from Ebola-infected countries or the plague will start and spread inside our borders. Act fast." And the second, and this is from a religious individual: "Now this Ebola epidemic can become a global pandemic, and that's another name for plague. It may be the great attitude adjustment that I believe is coming. Ebola could solve America's problems with atheism, homosexuality, sexual promiscuity, pornography, and abortion." Okay? Whether it's that law from Leviticus 13, or whether it's statements like that, yes, you got to be careful, you got to beware, you got to make sure that you're not in a position where you can catch a dangerous disease. But nowhere in those statements, whether it's Leviticus or it's in those modern statements, nowhere in those statements do you see what Jesus was all about. Compassion. Compassion for the afflicted. And it was absolutely outrageous, given that law from Leviticus, for a rabbi like Jesus to go be in the company and touch and heal lepers before a priest declared them clean. I find it ironic that even Jesus, after healing them, had to give them instructions to go and be verified by the priests. Even Jesus had to play by the rules to a certain extent. They had to go be verified by the priests, or he knew they wouldn't be accepted back into society. Can you imagine that even Jesus had to play by those rules? And they went back and they found themselves clean, and the priest declared their cleanness, and then only one came back. And of course, the reasons can be wide and varied. There's different reasons why each one of those 9 may not have come back. Some may have been very selfish and self-absorbed, and they never thought about going back and giving anybody thanks. Some may have been so damaged emotionally and spiritually by being ostracized and the nightmare that they went through that all they wanted to do was go as far away from that as possible before something else went wrong, and never a thought about going back and saying thanks. The pain was just too great. And then some were probably just so excited that they were clean and want to go back and reunite with the family and get those hugs and be in relationship again that they just plumb forgot. And so, yes, there are reasons why those 9 didn't come back. But the story doesn't lead us to a place where we dwell on that. The story takes us to the place where the one did. Where that one found his flesh restored. That one who felt the surge of wholeness come back to his body. That one who suddenly regained a hope that he lost, that he never thought he'd ever have again. And all the excitement that would go with the good news in your mind and your heart that I'm clean, I'm cured. And in those days, as I said, because everybody believed that leprosy was the sign of God's curse on you, if you didn't have it in their minds and hearts, what they believed was that the curse was lifted. And that one, before he went on to his life, once again, he went back to Jesus. He looked in his eyes and he said, "Thank you. This has made all the difference." You really have to step outside yourself to be able to do that. You know, Thanksgiving is coming up this week, and we all got plans, whatever they may be. They may be big plans, they may be little plans, they may be somewhere in between. And we're going to get together with people we care about and love, hopefully. But we also may be getting together with the big clan, and there's a few family members we kind of wonder about. And there may be some issues floating around in the air that aren't resolved yet, that you're either going to not deal with, but you're going to know are hanging there. There's going to be a lot of love and celebration, but there's going to be all kinds of stuff because it's a human mix. A variety of things that are going to happen on Thanksgiving. There's going to be a football game. There's going to be all kinds of stuff. But there's one thing. There's just one thing we remember going in. We have the opportunity, we have the blessing to choose to be that one. To not lose ourselves in wondering about the 9, but to be the one. And you know, if we really make that effort to be the one, we might even run into some of the other 9 and be the kind of influence on them that helps define for them why they're now well. But to go ourselves, this Thanksgiving, knowing we're going into it, looking into the face of God, and saying in our own way, by stepping outside of ourselves and being in God's presence, thanks, God. It has made all the difference. Thanks be to God.